Hi everyone, I want to talk to you today about what I think is the real reason why many of us are simply surviving rather than thriving at work, and specifically experiencing some emotional responses, quite strong emotional responses to situations at work, which are holding us back. So perhaps you recognise yourself in one of these. So perhaps you find yourself triggered by certain colleagues, or situations on a kind of an ongoing basis, or perhaps you struggle to assert yourself in meetings. This is one that I come up with a lot. I come up against a lot with many of my clients. Or you're self-sabotaging opportunities that are put in front of you, or another one is working overtime until you're completely burnt out. It's just a few suggestions, but these are things that I've probably experienced myself and seen many others experience as well. Now, the reason I think that these things are happening are actually connected to trauma. Now, your instant reaction is probably, well, I haven't experienced any trauma in my life. And I felt the same as well. And that's because we think of trauma with a capital T, so the big stuff, the physical, emotional, sexual abuse. And that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is trauma with a small t. Now, this is something that Dr. Valerie Rein, in her book Patriarchy Stress Disorder, talks about. And she kind of defines trauma in a much broader sense, which is something that really spoke to me. So she talks about trauma as in, trauma is any event or circumstance that made you feel unsafe in your fullest authentic expression and resulted in creating trauma adaptations. So no doubt we've all experienced those moments at work where we've been yelled at, perhaps criticised, ignored, rejected, and although those might seem like insignificant events, that if someone was to bring them up, you'd say, yeah, that happened to me, but it didn't really affect me, or yes, that happened, but I'm over it now. Those experiences essentially made you feel unsafe in some way. So unconsciously you shut down, you dimmed your lights, you created some kind of defense mechanism to protect yourself. So traumatic experiences are imprinted in the nervous system. So they're reactions that got wired to the experience of the event. So when we get triggered by a similar event, the body reacts in the only way that it knows how to keep us safe, because it's really clever. And it normally results in us going into one of three modes: fight, flight, or freeze mode. So I don't know about you, but in my career, I can recount many situations where I now realise, triggered by trauma, particularly in meetings, kind of self-sabotaging job opportunities, finding excuses or reasons why I wasn't good enough, crying in the toilets after a meeting, or when someone's criticised your work. These are all experiences that are triggering old trauma for ourselves, not just in our current lives, but also collectively, specifically if you're a woman, but also ancestral trauma as well. And I'm not going to go into that on this video, because that's a very big topic, probably for another day. But just to bring this to life for you, I'll share kind of a couple of different examples. So one, perhaps when you were in a meeting early on in your career, or even in class at school, you were a bit nervous, but you shared an idea that you had, and it was rejected or ignored, or worse still, it was pulled apart in some way. And it left you just feeling a bit embarrassed, wishing like you hadn't spoken up, looked like your ideas weren't worth listening to. And now, not surprisingly, fast forward however many years, you find in meetings that you just sit quietly, and you're struggling. You've got all these ideas brimming in your head, but there's fear and adrenaline running through your body, and you just feel unable to speak and to share your ideas. And you probably just told yourself, I'm not confident enough, I'm not confident in meetings, I'm not an assertive person, or my ideas aren't really that good. But actually what you've done there is you've gone into freeze mode, because it's triggered some trauma that's happened to you in the past. So that's just one example. Another example for fight mode. So again, I see this a lot with people who have lost their job unexpectedly. So and it's come out of the blue. So they've been made redundant or they've been fired, even though they thought they were doing a good job. So now they get the new job, but that anxiety follows them around. So every time they get called into a meeting with their boss, their body goes into, they start to feel anxious and fearful. Now, this may lead you to creating some trauma adaptations, such as working too hard, working ridiculous hours so that to keep you safe, so that you don't lose this next job. Or it could be just saying yes to everything, saying yes to every request that comes your way, or not speaking your mind in meetings and not saying what you really think. And these are, they're there to protect you, but they're also holding you back in your career, but also causing you undue stress and anxiety as well. That's normally called fight mode. You're like fighting to keep the job and for this not to happen again, but inevitably it just causes you to burn out. And then an example for flight mode is perhaps there's an opportunity for promotion at work, where you are absolutely qualified, but you just don't apply because of the fear of rejection. And this could be linked to perhaps, some previous rejection you've experienced. And this is flight mode. So you just avoid the situation. There are so many different examples. I've just shared one that kind of correlates to each of those modes. So hopefully that kind of, perhaps you related to one of those scenarios, or it's triggered an example that's come to you of something that trauma adaptation that perhaps you have formed for yourself to keep you safe. Now, I won't go into this, but as I mentioned earlier, you can layer on all the collective trauma, particularly if you're a woman or in kind of an ethnic minority as well, and ancestral trauma, because what that's done is pass down a survival DNA to keep you safe. But again, I'm not going to go into that today. So what can you do about this? Now, again, I'm not going to go into that in this video, but I think the first step to healing that trauma is in recognising those trauma adaptations. So I just ask you, as you go through your next week or couple of weeks, to just write down every time you notice yourself being triggered. So you're on a Zoom call and a colleague says something and it triggers you and you feel anxious or you feel angry or frustrated, anything like that. Just start to note down what the trigger was, what was going through your mind, and what it felt like in your body, and whether you recognise yourself going into fight, flight or freeze mode. And I would also massively, hopefully that's a helpful start to the healing journey. I would also massively recommend reading the book Patriarchy Stress Disorder, as I mentioned. It is specifically written for women, but essentially it's relatable to everyone. We're all living in a patriarchal society that's caused us to feel unsafe being our most authentic selves. So I just wanted to share that with you. Hopefully it's got you thinking about perhaps some of the behaviours that you're carrying out at work that are not serving you anymore, and that you would like to liberate yourself from, so that you can really thrive in your career. And if you've got any questions or you'd like to explore this a bit further, then do get in touch. Thank you.